Welcome, friends, enemies, and everyone in between, to my channel, The Masked Mormon. I am, in fact, The Masked Mormon.
Why are you wearing a mask? Were you burned by acid or something like that?
Oh no, it's just they're terribly comfortable. I think everyone will be wearing them in the future.
If you are returning, welcome back. If this is your first time here, I am a Mormon who used to believe in the truth claims of the Mormon Church. I did it all. I was baptized, served a mission, went to BYU, temple marriage, and all the rest of it. Now, I explore some of the implications of Mormon theology, culture, and some of my own personal experiences, and talk about it on the internet with you fine viewers. There has been an incredible response to my last video. Thank you all for watching, and it has been great to interact with those of you who commented. I have appreciated those who like what I'm doing here, and even those who disagree with me. Frankly, I was impressed with the temperance of the comments by most of the believers that I interacted with. And one question that stuck out, though, was why I even joined the church, and what my testimony was based on. This seems to be the restating of the common question of whether I actually believed, and why I don't believe now. And that is something I want to explore with you today. Specifically, why I stopped believing. Mormonism worked for me for quite a long time. In fact, it was designed for me, a white man. Receiving the priesthood, leadership callings, responsibilities, stewardship, mission, presiding, temple covenants, hierarchy, all of it was designed for a person like me. And for a while, it seemed like the church had all the answers to some of life's most important questions. I have always been keenly aware of my mortality. The philosophy of memento mori, or remember that you will die, for some reason has always hung very heavy in my mind, even as a child. I remember when I was 7 or 8 and was eating sunflower seeds with my uncle, who was my same age. I swallowed some of the shells, and he told me that I would die because I did that. Now, he can be quite the joker, but I took him very seriously. I remember the existential dread that settled upon me as I understood the finality of death, and I became very upset. But Mormonism had answers. The answers to not only what happens after death, but eternally after death, and even what happened before I was even born. And the church answered those questions with such an air of authority and confidence, I didn't stop to think about the quality of some of those answers for quite some time. Or I would trust the stories of the great promised blessings happening to unnamed others, like miraculous healings and things like that. Now, there always seems to be a friend of a friend stories that circulate the church zeitgeist. So, what went wrong? It is common for believers to call into question the testimony of former believers. They will commit the no true Scotsman fallacy. Since you don't believe anymore, you must not have had a real testimony. But I really did believe. And it's such an amazing story. God talking to a prophet and pouring out wisdom and guidance, angels, visions, gold plates, miracles allegedly being performed. It truly is an incredible story. From an early age, I held a belief in empiricism and the scientific method. My first great passion was dinosaurs. So I learned a lot about evolution, plate tectonics, asteroid impacts, geology, and biology from an early age. And those were the books I read at the library. While my friends were reading Choose Your Own Adventure, Goosebumps, Nancy Drew, and the sort, I was honestly reading encyclopedias, dinosaur books, atlases, astronomy books, National Geographic, and things like that. And even with my belief in empiricism and the scientific method, I still held that there were things that were not yet understood. I was still prone to magical thinking. And I would go to church, just a regular Christian church I was going to at the time, and I read Bible stories, and I had a belief that God worked via the scientific method, and that God resided in the gaps of our understanding. Now, it was quite the dichotomy of a belief in empiricism and of magical thinking. Evolution in the Garden of Eden, astronomy and prophecy, plate tectonics, and the Great Flood. The world was just as much a place of science as it was of magic for me. Now, growing up, I remember watching documentaries about some of the famous prophets through history, like Nostradamus, the 16th century astrologer and seer who wrote books full of prophecies. I remember having one of his books and reading some of his alleged prophecies and trying to see where people were getting some of the things that they were saying about what was happening in our day. Or about Edgar Cayce, the sleeping prophet, who would claim to have visions while in a sleep-like state. And I believe these stories. I found them compelling. When I was in middle school, I decided it was important to read the Bible from cover to cover. Even though my family no longer attended that Christian church, I still had a belief in God and Jesus. We had a few Bibles in the house. Also, over the years, the Jehovah's Witnesses would come by, as well as the Mormon missionaries. So we had a lot of Bibles to choose from. I remember picking up the Book of Mormon once and casually flipping through it. And I wondered, I wonder who that Alma lady is. And then I put the book back on the shelf. Now, those of you who aren't familiar with the Book of Mormon, Alma is one of the characters in the book and was an important male prophet in the narrative. The only Almas I knew at the time were women. I put the book back and I grabbed a regular Bible. And over the course of about 2 years, I read that Bible, about 3 chapters a night, and I would think about what I was reading. I remember how violent it was. I remember reading about how important sacrifice was. And I was asking myself, why don't people sacrifice animals anymore if it's so important? Now, I knew as a kid I couldn't afford an ox, but maybe birds were okay. No, okay, now don't worry, I did not sacrifice any animals, though I was seriously considering it. I finally eventually got to the New Testament, which said that such sacrifices weren't necessary anymore. Whew. I also started praying during that time. But to make a long story short, a few years later, when I was 16 or 17, I started attending and then joined the Mormon Church. I remember my very first time at church when I was in high school. I went with a close friend who was a member. For Sunday school, they were discussing the Book of Abraham. The teacher said that we would be talking about astronomy. Now, this really piqued my interest. A church that talks about astronomy? Now, this is something I can really get into. For those of you who know the contents of the Book of Abraham, you can imagine my confusion when the instructor started talking about Kolob, the star closest to the throne of God, and about how 1,000 years is like a day to God. Being a teenage know-it-all, I immediately raised my hand to argue with the instructor. And I learned very early that church members don't like being presented with information that contradicts their worldview, especially scientific information. Now, this was Mormonism in the 1990s, so very different than today. The internet was new, and there was no Google. So the church had a fair degree of plausible deniability to difficult questions. Though I found everything pretty weird, I liked the people and the discussion, and I have always enjoyed thought-provoking discussions. I was also a big fan of stake dances. I knew how to dance, and though I had no other game in any other avenue of my life, this was a skill that was much appreciated. One of the strengths of the Mormon Church is how it can integrate people by giving them responsibilities and making them a part of the community. I was ordained to the priesthood, and I prepared and blessed the sacrament, or communion, every week. I even learned how to tie a tie. And I tell you this to let you know I took it very seriously. Often the narrative that believers will tell each other about non-believers is that they really didn't believe, or that they didn't take it seriously. I definitely did, and I definitely took it very seriously. Now, for the most part, I enjoyed church. I drove myself to church every week. Sunday school and priesthood were super engaging. Each year, we would cover different books of Scripture in Sunday school. Old Testament, New Testament, Book of Mormon, Doctrine and Covenants, and church history. There was also a repeat of this curriculum in our early morning seminary class. though seminary went into a little bit more depth. I only got 2 years of this in high school since I joined the church about midway through, and I loved how there seemed to be an answer to just about everything. Any question seemed to have an authoritative answer from the leadership. Though I did run into some conflicts when things like Adam and Eve or Noah's Ark or the aforementioned astronomy topics came up. I knew that the earth was billions of years old and that humans evolved from earlier forms of life. It didn't seem reasonable that all those animals could fit on an ark. The law of consecration seemed a lot like communism, and so on. But Mormonism answers questions so confidently, and it tries to back them up with feelings or spiritual experiences that are interpreted as the Holy Ghost. The reasoning goes that if you have a testimony of Joseph Smith and the Book of Mormon, everything that proceeds from Joseph and his successors was true. And if you stop to question anything, then your integrity, or your level of belief, or your fidelity to the community are called into question, which serves as a powerful force to keep people in line. Plus, if you have any epistemic humility, any gaps in your knowledge can be exploited with thought-stopping cliches. I would be told things like, well, that isn't essential to your salvation, or God's ways are higher than our ways, or you should avoid the spirit of contention, or avoid the appearance of evil, or let's see, what else? The prophets cannot lead us astray. What else? Milk before meat. Things like that. What are some other thought-stopping cliches that you were told? After high school, I attended BYU, and the tension between my academic and spiritual selves was especially apparent. I studied physics, which of course is very empirical, but then I took the required religion courses. I had never read the Book of Mormon, so I took that course first. I found it fascinating and was kind of excited to see what it was all about. I remember people talking about asking God to know if the book was true. And as I sat down for my first reading assignment for the course, I remember praying and having a very strong spiritual experience. And because Mormonism interprets your spiritual experiences for you as indicating that it is all true, I took that as my answer. It was a powerful experience, but I interpret it very differently these days. There were a lot of contradictions at BYU. The university is very rigorous in its math, sciences, and engineering classes, but holds the church interpretations in its religion classes. One ends up having to compartmentalize science stuff and church stuff. Plus, being so busy with difficult classes and trying unsuccessfully to date and have a balanced social life kept me from thinking too deeply about things. And that is something the church culture excels at, is keeping you too busy to think about anything too deeply. Callings, marrying young, having children young, supporting a family, paying tithing, all keep you too busy to think about much else. Eventually, I had been in church long enough to go through the rotation of scriptures in my classes and in Sunday school, which then repeats the sequence. Now this was about the time I went on a mission, which is a whole new dimension of busy. But as I got back and was really paying attention a lot more, I started to notice that the same questions that were asked in the last time around in Sunday school were asked again, with the same answer that was expected. I also noticed that the questions that were often asked were leading questions, questions that had a specific answer. An example of something like, what does this warning in the Book of Mormon suggest about those who condemn the Book of Mormon? Or, why is the Book of Mormon crucial to the restored gospel? Or, how does gaining a testimony of the Book of Mormon help people know that Joseph Smith is a true prophet and that the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints is the true church? The first 4 years, things were exciting and fresh. Then, the next 4 years were familiar and cozy. And the 4 years after that, they started to get a little stale and flat. 4 years after that, insipid and boring. And then, 4 years after that, frustrating and shallow. I started to realize that Mormonism was a mile wide and an inch deep. Just imagine, if you will, what it would be like if you had to repeat 4th grade over and over and over again. Sure, the first couple of times would be interesting and new, and you would get good at everything. But year after year after year of repeating the same thing would leave you, first of all, with the illusion that you knew all there was to know, but then it would just leave you feeling bored. What's more, if you thrive on intellectual pursuits like I do, you start to feel intellectually starved. I would ask, why don't we delve into more detail or cover new material? And I would be told that when we start to understand the basic stuff, then, and only then, will God give us more light and knowledge. But I wanted to go deeper. And I'm not saying into the more esoteric or speculative aspects of Mormon theology, just deeper. Get into the scholarship, the history, the comparisons, the languages, and so much more. But people would push back and say, they don't want that. Or they would even say, church wasn't the place for that kind of stuff. Well, if not church, then when? Then where? I started to realize that church meetings weren't so much about learning. Sunday school is a misnomer. There is no schooling that happens. Everything is just devotional. Fellow ward members would tell me that they don't want to go to church to think about things, but to feel good. Ward after ward I would go to, and people would say the same things. And I became more and more bored. I was constantly fed a diet of milk in the church. They promised that meat would be on the menu, but it never was served. So I took my spiritual learning into my own hands. I started to learn about biblical criticism and the documentary hypothesis. I learned about criticisms to this hypothesis. I started to explore some of the claims of Mormonism from a rational perspective. Do the claims hold up to scrutiny? Now, I started small. I started with the assumption that the church was true. I looked at Nephi's voyage from the Arabian Peninsula to the Americas. I asked, now, if this really happened, which way would they have gone? Looking at the winds and the currents, it seemed that instead of heading across the Indian and Pacific Oceans and landing in South America, like I had always been taught, they instead would have made their way around Africa and into the Atlantic Ocean, making several stops along the way to resupply, then landing somewhere in North America. Since the Book of Mormon claimed that they were the house of Israel and kept the law of Moses, they would have wanted to have a familiar set of stars to keep track of the seasons for the festivals and sacrifices that they would have needed to perform. Now, this exercise was exciting, and for a while it made things seem more real, and I was able to engage with the text in a novel way. Then, after that, I tackled Noah's Ark. I had previously learned that the story of Job was originally an allegorical play. So I figured that several Old Testament stories could be similarly fictional. I started analyzing the story of the Ark. I asked questions like, where did all the water come from? Where did it go? Why can't a wooden boat be built that big now? How did the kangaroos and koalas get to Australia after the flood? Why didn't all the fish die? What did everything eat? Where did all the poop go? Were there dinosaurs? How did the llamas get to the Americas after the flood? What about all the insects, the diseases? Why was the story of Noah repurposed from the Epic of Gilgamesh? I started to realize that this story was fictional, as was the story of the Tower of Babel. But that started to feel a little dangerous, because I had been taught that the earth needed to be baptized, hence the flood, and that the Book of Mormon depended on a literal Tower of Babel. Ooh. This started to raise some interesting questions. I was listening to podcasts and reading books about where the Bible came from, and I realized that the church was at least 200 years behind on biblical scholarship. There was so much known about where the holy texts of Christianity and Judaism came from that Mormonism was just ignorant to. I learned about the evolving Christology of the Gospels in the New Testament, specifically how Jesus became holy earlier and earlier. First at his resurrection, then his baptism, then eventually before he was even born. Now this floored me. Then I started to look into the book of Abraham. This is one of the products of Joseph Smith's translations. Joseph came into the possession of several Egyptian papyri and claimed to translate them into the book of Abraham. The papyrus was lost for a time, then eventually found again, and was translated by Egyptologists. And lo and behold, it was nothing like what Joseph claimed it to be. It was a common funeral text that was prepared for a body during the mummification and burial process. It contained the instructions and spells to guide someone into the afterlife. It was not the story of Abraham. Now, this started me into an existential crisis, not unlike my episode with the sunflower seeds. I felt my whole worldview falling apart, including my knowledge of what happens when I die. If Joseph Smith was so very wrong about this, that means he could be just as wrong about the Book of Mormon. This is when my proverbial shelf crashed and started me on a furious quest to try to salvage Mormonism. Now, anyone who has been through a faith crisis knows the sinking feelings that comes with this shelf-crashing moment. If you haven't experienced a faith crisis before, your chest seizes up. You have this dizzying, sinking feeling. This deep sadness envelops you, and you realize it was all a lie. You want to grasp for anything, but it all evaporates like a puff of vapor. I remember doing a population study on the growth of the Book of Mormon people. A clear reading of the text implies that the land was empty when Lehi and his family arrived. I realized that the population growth was impossible, and also that the battles described were too large. The armies were enormous, even by today's standards. The logistics necessary to supply those armies would be untenable for the time. Now, I tried looking at apologetic answers, but they didn't really hold up to scrutiny. They would try to solve one problem, but then create 3 more problems in the process. The answers could placate someone who just wanted to know that somebody had at least thought about the issues. But for someone who wanted to know if the answers provided were correct, I realized that they just didn't hold up. A passing glance wasn't enough to provide a plausible solution for me. And a lot of this was accelerated in 2015 when the policy of exclusion for gay members was rolled out. Now, it seemed eerily similar to the temple ban of black members that had ended in 1978. So many of the same reasons were given to justify both policies. Or were they revelations? Bit by bit, my belief unraveled. Church became more and more uncomfortable. It seemed shallower and shallower, more insipid. But at the same time, I still loved the people. I am a very social person. I thrive on personal interactions. And all of my social groups were associated with the church. A person who goes through a faith crisis goes through a sort of mourning process, including the so-called stages of grief, including anger. I was an elders quorum president at the time and was trying to moderate my anger and navigate a high-demand calling. I also started to let my wife, the mass mistress, know about this faith crisis. Now, this was especially scary, as I knew from some of the podcasts I listened to that if one partner's faith changed, the other may demand a divorce. I didn't want that. So, I let things out slowly, just a bit by bit. I didn't do an info dump on her, which was a great approach. We still attended church, and then she started to become more nuanced. Maybe a little too nuanced, because she ended up getting fired from a young women's presidency she was in. In order to make the characters of the Book of Mormon seem more realistic, she called Nephi a jerk, and said that Nephi would probably be an insufferable individual to be around. Well, calling a Book of Mormon prophet hero a jerk is apparently just too dangerous to expose children to, and she was soon after released. It was kind of funny. Now I continued to learn about church history and doctrine. I learned about the evolution of the word of wisdom and about the evolution of the law of tithing. I realized that they were convenient tools of control that the leadership wielded to keep members in line. I started to develop a love for tea and then coffee. I paid tithing on surplus for a time. Then I stopped altogether. Especially when I learned about the dragon's hoard of wealth the church was hiding away. The temple was never a favorite thing for me, but I went because I was told how important it was. I always expected some sort of revelation or strong experience, but it never came. I started to see the temple liturgy as a more of an allegory. I had long since rejected the idea of a literal Garden of Eden and Adam and Eve, but I felt that the temple was at least a good place to meditate and relax, even though I always felt ridiculous in the temple clothes. The temple name, the signs and tokens, the veil, all of it eventually lost power for me. I remember the last time the Mass Mistress and I attended the temple. We did some proxy sealings with some friends of ours. Both of our shelves had crashed, and we were beginning to practice mindfulness meditation. And so, we both meditated through the session. It was relaxing, and we enjoyed our time with our friends. But the importance of the temple evaporated for us as well. And even though we held the temple recommend for a couple years after that, we never went again. I did serve a mission. I went at 21 instead of 19 because I felt that as a recent convert, I was suddenly being pressured to go on a mission and teach people about a thing I knew nothing about. Now it left a bad taste in my mouth, and so I refused to go. But BYU can be a very powerful place. The culture demands that men serve missions. And if you don't go, you are untouchable, meaning that women won't talk to you, let alone date you. I did eventually determine to go, and it was largely a positive experience. I gained some friends that I keep in touch with even now. But ultimately, my mission didn't do anything to help me advance my life. If anything, it set me behind about 3 years. But I was an obedient missionary. I followed the rules. I served in leadership positions my entire mission. By all accounts, I was a successful missionary. But when I got back, I realized that a mission is only important before you go. It doesn't set you up for anything afterwards. As I reflected on the purpose of my mission, my exit interview with my mission president came to mind. He said that the most important convert on your mission is yourself. Now all of a sudden, the purpose of a mission became very clear. It was designed to be difficult, exhausting, and demoralizing in order to bind the missionary to the church, in order to bring the next generation into the church, and then repeat the cycle. As the spell of Mormonism was broken, I then turned my attention to Jesus and God in general. The same tools that are used to deconstruct Mormonism are just as effective to deconstruct religion in general. I tried to attend other churches for a while, but getting familiar with their culture and doctrine, frankly, it seemed exhausting. And even though there was a little holy envy about some of the different ways that they did things, they still felt empty. And to make a long story a little shorter, I realized that there were similar logical, theological, historical, cultural, and literary problems with the Old and New Testaments. The supernatural claims just didn't hold up. However, that being said, after letting go of a belief in any of the religions, I still find that the Bible is a fascinating piece of literature. When belief is divorced from it, all of a sudden you can explore some of the implications of its teachings, and it becomes even more fascinating. So, where does this leave me? Well, the pandemic shutdown allowed the Mass Mistress and me to have some time to process our feelings. I was able to deal with my anger on my own without dragging our Mormon friends into it. I was able to process and grieve and come to a place of more or less peace. I deconstructed Mormonism and religion in general. I don't believe in the gods of any of the religions anymore. Though I hope there is something bigger out there, yet I have no good reason to necessarily believe that there is. Hoping and wanting something doesn't necessarily make it real. That being said, I have a hard time taking the atheist label on myself. I admire many of the teachings of Jesus. I see him as a revolutionary rabble-rouser, as a symbol to look after the marginalized and the weakest of society, as a symbol to stand up to unjust power. I don't think believing in the supernatural stories about him are important. If Jesus is real and divine, I think it is more important to live up to John 13:34 through 35. A new commandment I give unto you, that ye love one another. As I have loved you, that ye also love one another. By this shall all men know that ye are my disciples, if ye have love one to another. Now there are many Mormons, and Christians in general, that feign to know the will of God and Jesus, yet they end up acting more like the Pharisees. Now what do you think is better? An atheist who treats people in a Christ-like way, or a Christian who treats people poorly, notwithstanding their strong belief in Jesus? Though I deconstructed religion in general, I still think that they are an important aspect of the human experience. Though I don't believe anymore and critically examine the truth claims of the church on the internet, I still love Mormons. I have accepted that they are my tribe. However, I engage with the church on my own terms. I find no use for sacrament meeting or Sunday school. Let me take that back. I will on rare occasions attend Sunday school to push back on a particularly problematic lesson, like pushing back on the story of Abraham attending to end his son Isaac. I will occasionally attend priesthood and participate by trying to add nuanced comments. I also attend activities, and I will help organize service projects that I feel are meaningful and not self-serving to the organization. I ultimately want the people to be better. And then you might ask, but what about those spiritual experiences you had? Something that Mormonism does is interprets your spiritual experiences for you. It tells you what they mean. And for the church, it always points to the church being true. But people have these experiences all the time, inside and outside the church. Perhaps they are providence shining down. Or perhaps they're part of the human experience. I have had deeply meaningful spiritual experiences. One I already told you about when I decided to read the Book of Mormon for the first time. I've also had them when each of my children were born. They were special and deeply meaningful. I continue to have these experiences even now. I recognize that many of them are due to the emotion of elevation. And because I better know what to look for, I know how to seek these experiences out a whole lot better than when I believed. Heck, I can have them when I'm watching Star Trek, or having a coffee with a friend, or just even connect with a loved one on a personal level. I don't have to attribute them to the church or interpret them as telling me that the church is something that it is not. This hijacking of a special human experience is especially insidious, because the organization can then use those experiences to its own purpose. The impetus for all of this, though, was the fact that I began to recognize how shallow what the church offered was. It talks a big game, but then it fails to deliver. I was open to believing all of the truth claims. Mormonism also promises some pretty impressive things, but then, unfortunately, it fails to deliver. And when it does fail to deliver, it blames you for not being faithful enough or believing hard enough. And I internalized that blame for a long time, and it kept me going for quite a while. But after repeating the 4th grade so many times, I was left starving. I would ask for bread and get rocks instead. I knocked, and no one answered. I gathered all the data, Then I examined the history and the truth claims, and I realized that the experiment failed. The hypothesis of Mormonism wasn't supported by observation. But, alas, Mormonism gets into your bones. Some people are content to leave it behind completely. But I still find it immensely fascinating. I see the development of Mormonism over the last 200 years as a microcosm of the evolution of Christianity over the last 2,000 years. The story of Mormonism is immensely interesting, at least to me. And now I'm not encumbered by my fear of offending a deity. I am free to ask questions, explore implications, and tell my story, and I am glad to share that with all of you. What are your thoughts? Why did you stop believing? If you are still a believer, if the church weren't true, would you want to know why or why not? Let me know down in the comments. And if you like what I do, please like, share, and subscribe, and I will see you next time.